Welcome, wanderer, and welcome back to Haunted Graves After Dark. Before we step into the shadows tonight, before we walk down the cracked brick paths of Savannah's oldest burial ground, tell me something, where are you watching from? I always love reading your comments, seeing the cities and countries glowing in the darkness like distant lanterns. Go on, type it now. Because tonight, you and I are traveling far from home. Back to Savannah, Georgia, in the sticky, humid summer of 1963, where the nights were so quiet you could hear the river whisper, and the moss hanging from the oak trees moved even when the wind didn't. A place where stories never stayed buried for long. Let me take you there. Picture a narrow road just outside the historic district, lined with cracked stone walls and iron lampposts that flickered like candles fighting to stay alive. At the end of that road stood a cemetery older than the country itself, Graywick Cemetery, founded sometime in the 1700s, long before the Revolution, before anyone thought Savannah would become one of the most haunted cities in the United States. Most locals avoided Graywick. Not because of ghosts, Savannah had plenty of those. But because of something stranger. Something the sheriff never solved, and something the townspeople never agreed on. An event that repeated itself every single night, without fail. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the cemetery's wrought iron entrance. A heavy gate weighing nearly 400 pounds. Slammed shut on its own, with a force that rattled windows on the houses nearby. Some said it was the wind. Some said it was superstition. And some said it was the spirit of a man buried there, a man who did not want company. I'm going to tell you his story. But first, you need to see the cemetery the way the people of 1963 saw it. Imagine walking toward the gate on a hot night. The iron is rusted, but the shape is beautiful, curving leaves, twisting vines, wrought into cold metal by a blacksmith who went mad before he finished the left panel. And above it, barely readable even then, was a carved name. Graywick Family Cemetery, 1764. But it wasn't only the Graywick family buried inside. Over time, the city used it for soldiers, paupers, plague victims, and others they preferred not to speak about. Locals said the dead outnumbered the living by thousands. And they said the dead did not rest easy. Children dared each other to touch the gate after midnight. Adults warned them not to. And just beyond the entrance, between two enormous oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, stood a low stone tomb with no name on its surface, just a single carved symbol, a circle split down the middle by a jagged line. That tomb, they said, belonged to a man known only as the Watcher. Nobody knew his real name. Nobody knew his past. Only that he had been buried alone, away from the other graves, and that strange things had happened around his tomb since the day they sealed it. One gravekeeper claimed the stone lid trembled at night, like someone was knocking from the inside. Another said he heard whispers coming from the crack along the bottom edge. A third swore he saw a handprint appear on the dust-covered slab, on the inside. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Savannah believed it. And that brings us to the night everything began, the night the gate first slammed shut on its own. But before we dive into the darkness, before the screams, before the sheriff's investigation, before the disappearance that shook the city, let me tell you who was the first to witness it. His name was Elias Turner, a quiet, sharp-eyed, 32-year-old night security guard who had just moved from North Carolina. A real man, with real fears, and real regrets etched into his face. If you saw him, you'd notice he always looked like he hadn't slept enough. Thick eyebrows, tired but alert eyes, a squared jaw covered in rough stubble, and a permanent tension in the corners of his mouth like he was always waiting for bad news. Elias didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in overtime pay. On his first night shift at the cemetery, he walked the perimeter with a flashlight that flickered more than it shined. Crickets buzzed. A dog barked somewhere far away. And the humidity wrapped around him like a wet blanket. He didn't notice anything strange at first. Not until he reached the stone tomb, the one with the strange symbol. The one locals avoided. His flashlight flickered dangerously. Not tonight, he muttered, smacking it lightly. It stayed on, barely. And that's when he noticed something he would swear to later. A thin line of fresh dirt at the base of the tomb's lid. Not dust. Not old soil kicked up by rain. Fresh. Loose. As if something inside had been pushing upward. Elias bent down slowly, sweat dripping down his back despite the still air. As he leaned closer, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. From beneath the stone slab. He jerked backward so hard he dropped the flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the trees, across the other graves, and then landed on the gate. It was slightly open. Only slightly. But enough that a cold shiver crawled up his arms. He picked up the flashlight with shaking hands, its weak beam bouncing as he backed away from the tomb. He wanted to call the sheriff. Or his supervisor. Or anyone. But his radio hissed with static, picking up something that didn't sound like interference, more like a voice trying to push through water. He whispered to himself, "It's just the humidity. Radios act up in heat." But the tapping behind him grew louder. He turned. Stared at the tomb. The tapping stopped. The air felt heavy. Wrong. And then. The gate screeched. Not slowly. Not like metal whining from rust. But like something massive had been hurled shut by an invisible force. Bang! The slam echoed so hard Elias felt it vibrate through his ribs. Birds shot out of the trees in a flurry. The flashlight died completely. And Elias stood there, swallowed in darkness, the sound of the gate still ringing in his ears. He didn't run, though he wanted to. The kind of run where you don't look back, where you pretend the thing behind you can't catch you if you move fast enough. But Elias was stubborn. And he was scared of losing his job more than he was scared of the dead. So he walked toward the gate, slowly, cautiously, listening with every step for something following him. When he reached it, he reached out a trembling hand and touched the iron. It was ice cold. In the humid summer heat. He whispered, "No, that's not possible." Then something even stranger. The gate wasn't just closed. It was locked. The heavy bolt had slammed into place from the inside. That bolt needed 2 hands and serious weight to operate. Elias had trouble with it even during the day. But tonight, it was locked tight. And he was locked in. He heard the tapping again behind him. Soft at first. Then louder. Then scraping. Like fingernails dragging across stone. He turned slowly, every muscle in his body tight. His breath caught. The tomb was open. Not fully. Not dramatically. But the lid had shifted at least an inch, enough to reveal a black line of darkness beneath it, a gap that had definitely not been there minutes before. Elias whispered, "Oh God." The scraping came again. This time, from inside the tomb. And that is where tonight's chapter ends, Wanderer. Before we go deeper, before we step into the heart of Savannah's buried secrets, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your country or city down below. Because chapter 2, the night the sheriff arrived, is only going to get darker. The people of Savannah woke on the morning of June 14, 1963, to rumors that spread faster than the summer heat. Someone claimed they heard the Graywick Cemetery gate slam just after midnight. Someone else claimed they heard a scream. By sunrise, the story had already twisted itself into a dozen versions, some with a ghost, some with a demon, some with a man crawling out of his own grave. Sheriff Marshall Hargrove didn't believe any of it. He was a big, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with thick sideburns and a square face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His uniform always perfectly pressed. His voice always calm. And his patience always running thin whenever the townspeople brought him stories about the dead walking. He drove his dusty patrol car up the dirt road toward Graywick Cemetery with a sigh heavy enough to fog the windshield. A gate slamming, he muttered. Lord, help me if that's what counts as an emergency around here. But when he arrived, he found Elias Turner, the night guard, sitting on the stone wall by the entrance, pale as chalk, breathing in shaky bursts, and staring at the gate like it might move on its own again. Sheriff Hargrove stepped out of the car and shut the door hard. Turner. You look like you spent the night wrestling a hurricane. Elias swallowed hard. Sheriff, something happened last night. The sheriff raised an eyebrow. That so? Want to tell me why the folks near the river heard my cemetery gate slam like thunder? Elias nodded. Then hesitated. Then nodded again. Hargrove crossed his arms. Well? Speak. Elias tried to, but the words stuck to the back of his throat. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He'd spent hours just replaying the tapping, the scraping, the cold iron gate locked from the inside. He knew how it sounded. Like a ghost story. Like madness. But he forced himself to say it. The gate shut on its own, Sheriff. It locked me in. Hargrove snorted. Wind'll do things like that. No wind, Elias insisted. Not last night. You sure? Yes. He hesitated. And the tomb, the old stone one near the oaks, it moved. Hargrove's face didn't react, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. Moved? The lid? Elias nodded. His hands were shaking again. Sheriff, I heard something inside it. Something. A tapping. Then scraping. Hargrove let out a long, slow breath. Son, I want you to think real clear before you answer this. Were you drinking? Sleeping on the job? Seeing shadows after staring at the dark too long? Elias shook his head violently. No, sir. I wasn't imagining things. I've worked nights for years. I know the difference between a trick of the dark and something real. The sheriff sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and finally said, All right. Show me. Elias stood, still trembling, and led him through the gate, now unlocked, now still, now harmless looking in the daylight. The cemetery felt different in the morning. The trees whispered gently with the breeze, the Spanish moss swaying like fingers brushing the air. Sunlight spilled through the branches, revealing flowers, old stones, cracked pathways. Peaceful. Beautiful, even. But Elias didn't feel peace. Not one bit. He walked straight toward the tomb. The sheriff followed, boots crunching on gravel. I swear, he muttered, you cemetery boys let your own imaginations bury you alive. But when they reached the tomb, he stopped walking. Because something was wrong. Very wrong. The tomb's lid, usually a perfect, flush fit, was slightly off-center. Pulled to the left by 2, maybe 3 centimeters. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But enough for Hargrove's instincts to sharpen. He knelt beside it. No footprints. No pry marks. No tools. He pressed a hand to the stone. This thing weighs at least 600 pounds. Elias nodded. I didn't touch it. Hargrove didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could see that Elias was too shaken to be lying. All right, the sheriff finally said, help me check it. Together they tried to shift the lid back into place. Nothing. It didn't budge. They pushed harder. Still nothing. Then Elias said quietly, Sheriff, this isn't the direction it usually slides. Hargrove looked at him. Meaning what? Meaning, it didn't move because someone pushed it from the outside. He hesitated. It moved because something pushed from the inside. The sheriff stood up abruptly, brushing dust off his hands. Don't jump to conclusions. Something else is going on here. But he didn't sound convinced. Before either man could speak again, a voice called out from behind them. Sheriff. Hey Sheriff. They turned to see Ruth McCulley, a local woman in her late 50s who walked her dog past the cemetery every morning. Except today the dog wasn't with her. Ruth's face was pale. Fear lined every wrinkle. Hargrove walked toward her. Ruth. What's wrong? She pointed down the path with a shaking hand. Sheriff, my dog. He didn't come home this morning. That mutt runs off all the time, Hargrove said gently. Not like this. Her voice cracked. Sheriff, His leash was found in front of the cemetery gate. Snapped clean in half. Elias swallowed hard. Something inside him whispered that the dog was dead. Or worse, not entirely dead. Hargrove looked uneasy now. Not scared. Just thoughtful. A man whose instincts were beginning to turn in a direction he didn't want them to. He told Ruth he'd look into it, then sent her home. But as soon as she was out of earshot, he said to Elias, "We're not telling anyone about the tomb." Not yet. Elias frowned. Why? Because if word gets out that a grave looks disturbed, half this town will panic, and the other half will show up with lanterns trying to talk to ghosts. Elias nodded slowly. Tonight, the sheriff continued, "I'm coming back. And you're coming with me." Elias's breath caught. Sheriff. No arguments. Something's not sitting right. And I'm not leaving this place unwatched tonight. Elias felt dread churn in his stomach like thick oil. Sheriff, whatever was inside that tomb. Was probably a raccoon, Hargrove interrupted. Or shifting earth. Or erosion. Or anything except what your imagination is screaming at you. But the sheriff wasn't as confident as he pretended. Elias could see it. Something had rattled him. Something had unsettled the unshakable Sheriff Hargrove. The two men left the cemetery together, but neither spoke on the walk back to the gate. Something had changed. Something neither wanted to name. That night arrived quickly. Savannah sunsets were slow, glowing things, but the darkness always came fast once the last orange light faded. Elias met the sheriff outside the cemetery at 11:30 p.m. The sheriff arrived with a lantern, a revolver, and 2 cups of coffee so strong the steam rose like ghostly fingers. "You ready?" Hargrove asked. Elias wasn't ready. But he nodded anyway. Together they stepped inside. The air immediately felt colder. Not cool. Cold. A drop of at least 15 degrees. Hargrove paused. "That normal?" "No," Elias whispered. The trees were silent. No crickets. No breeze. No sounds at all. Like the entire night was holding its breath. They walked to the center of the cemetery, their lantern swaying, throwing shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the ground. When they reached the tomb, Hargrove stopped. "We stay here till midnight," he said. "Then we see what that gate decides to do." Elias nodded, though his eyes were fixed on the tomb. At 11:50, nothing happened. At 11:55, still nothing. But at 11:58, Elias felt something shift in the air. A pressure. Like the atmosphere tightening around them. The sheriff felt it too. He reached for his revolver. At 12:02, the tapping began. Soft. Slow. Like fingertips knocking against stone. Elias's breath hitched. Hargrove whispered, "Dear God." The tapping grew louder. Faster. More frantic. Then a scraping sound began. A long, horrible dragging noise, like claws raking the underside of the lid. Elias grabbed the lantern tighter. The sheriff aimed his gun at the tomb. At 12:03, the cemetery gate slammed shut behind them with a thunderous crack that echoed so hard the earth seemed to tremble. Bang! Both men spun toward the noise. The lantern flickered wildly. Something moved behind them. Something pushing. Something lifting. They turned back just in time to see it. The stone lid of the tomb sliding upward. As if lifted by unseen hands. A gap opened. A dark, impossible gap. And something inside exhaled. A slow, cold breath that smelled like old earth and decay. Elias froze. Hargrove whispered, "Stay behind me." But the lid slid another few inches. And something pale. Thin. And human-like. Pressed against the opening from inside. A hand. A hand with long fingers and cracked nails. Alive. Moving. Trying to get out. Elias screamed. Hargrove raised his gun. And the tomb continued opening, inch by horrifying inch. Greywick Cemetery held its breath as the tomb lid scraped open. The moon hung low over Savannah, flooding the stones with silver light that made every shadow look sharper, deeper, more alive. Sheriff Marshal Hargrove felt sweat slide down his back even though the night air was cold enough to sting his skin. Elias Turner stood beside him frozen stiff, the lantern shaking so badly the flame stuttered and flared like it feared the dark as much as they did. The lid moved another inch. The scraping echoed like metal dragged across bone. Then, from the crack of the tomb, that pale hand slipped out, fingers stretching across the stone like something relearning how to move. Elias made a strangled sound, part gasp, part sob. Hargrove whispered, "Don't move." But it was too late. The hand moved again, curling, stretching, almost feeling for the air. Then the fingers flexed. Not stiff. Not decayed. Alive. The sheriff raised his revolver. "Whatever's in there, don't take another." The lantern flames surged, as if a gust of icy wind rushed from inside the tomb. The lid trembled. Shifted. Lifted. And then it slammed back down. Hard. The impact echoed across every grave. Elias nearly dropped the lantern. Did it go back inside? Hargrove didn't answer. He stared at the tomb, jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched beside his ear. The cemetery gate creaked behind them. Not slammed. Not shut. Just creaked. Like someone, or something, was opening it slowly. The sheriff turned sharply. The gate was standing wide open. It hadn't been open a second ago. Elias whispered, "Sheriff, who opened it?" "No one," Hargrove said, but his voice had lost all steadiness. "No one human." He walked toward the gate, gun raised, eyes scanning the darkness. Elias followed close, lantern held high. Halfway there, they both stopped. Footprints. Small. Animal-like. Dog. They led into the cemetery. Elias's voice cracked. "Ruth's dog." Hargrove knelt, tracing the prints with the barrel of his gun. They were fresh, pressed deep into the soft earth. But something was wrong. The spacing, the drag marks. They didn't look like a dog running. They looked like a dog being pulled. Then the prints stopped. Just stopped. Like the animal had vanished mid-step. Elias shivered. "Sheriff, we should go." "We're not leaving this place uninvestigated," Hargrove snapped, but his voice wasn't hard. It trembled just slightly. "Something's out here. Something real." He started forward again, following the path deeper into the cemetery. But a soft sound drifted through the air. A whimper. Weak. Painful. Elias grabbed the sheriff's sleeve. "Sheriff, did you hear that?" Hargrove raised the lantern higher and followed the sound. It led them behind a cluster of leaning tombstones and toward an old water pump rusted from decades of disuse. And lying beside it was the dog. Ruth's dog. Or what was left of it. Elias gagged. Hargrove froze. The dog wasn't torn apart. Not eaten. Not mutilated. Just dead. Neck broken. Eyes open, reflecting the lantern light in a way that made them look human. Hargrove knelt beside the animal. No blood. No struggle. Something killed him quick. Elias's eyes darted around the shadows. "Sheriff, it's still here." Hargrove rose slowly. "Keep that lantern steady." They backed away from the dog. But before they reached the path again, the wind shifted. Cold. Carrying the faintest sound. Breathing. Coming from behind them. Elias spun, lantern shaking violently. The sheriff turned too, gun raised, finger on the trigger. Nothing. Just tombstones and trees. But the breathing continued. Slow. Measured. Not animal. Not normal. Then, just as the sheriff tightened his grip, Something stepped out from behind the oak tree. A silhouette. Tall. Thin. Wrong. It moved with a stiffness that made Elias's stomach twist. Like bones didn't bend the way they should. The lantern's light hit its face. Elias screamed. Its skin was gray, loose in some places, tight in others, as if it didn't fit the skull underneath. Its eyes were dark, sunken, reflective like a cat's. Its mouth hung slightly open, lips dry and cracked. But the worst part, the part that made the sheriff actually step back, was the mark on its neck. A deep indentation. The imprint of a coffin number plate. Elias gasped, that's the person from inside the tomb. The figure tilted its head as if confused by voices. Then it stepped forward, slow, dragging one leg. Hargrove raised his gun. Stop right there. Identify yourself. The thing didn't stop. I said stop or I'll. The creature hissed, not an animal sound, not a human sound. A long, rattling hiss like air escaping old lungs. Hargrove fired. The gunshot echoed across the graves. The creature jerked back, staggered, then straightened. The bullet had hit. Elias could see the small dark hole in its chest. But no blood came out. None. Instead the creature simply kept walking. Sheriff Hargrove fired again. Then again. 3 shots. Straight into the chest. Each impact made the thing rock backward. But still it advanced. Elias's voice cracked. Why isn't it dying? Hargrove didn't answer. Because he didn't know. The creature was almost upon them when something strange happened. Its steps slowed. Its head shifted. It began sniffing the air, not with its nose, but with small, shuddering movements of its entire body. Then it turned. Not toward them. Toward the tomb it came from. As if something was calling it back. Then it walked away, limping, dragging its leg, vanishing into the darkness behind the mausoleums. Elias collapsed to his knees. Sheriff, what was that? Hargrove's hands shook as he reloaded his revolver. I don't know. But we're leaving. But, what if it comes back? It will, the sheriff said grimly. And when it does, we'll have backup. They hurried out of the cemetery. When they reached the gate, the sheriff paused and looked back. The tomb was closed again. Perfectly sealed. As if nothing had happened. The sheriff locked the gate with shaking hands. Elias asked, "Who are you calling?" "The police station." "No," the sheriff said. "Someone who knows more about this than anyone else in the county." "Who?" Hargrove didn't answer. Instead he walked to the patrol car and switched on the radio. A voice crackled through. "Marshal? That you? What's wrong?" The sheriff took a long breath. "Get me Dr. Harlan Crow. Immediately." Elias blinked. "Crow? The coroner?" "No," Hargrove said. "The man who used to be the coroner." Elias paled. "You mean the one who quit after the incident in '49? Hargrove nodded grimly. "He's the only one who ever claimed to see something like this." The radio voice replied, uneasy, "Marshal. Crow hasn't left his house in years." "Tell him it's about Greywick Cemetery," Hargrove said. There was a long silence. Then the voice replied, "I'll get him." Hargrove ended the transmission and leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily as the weight of the night settled on him. Elias stared at him, searching for answers in the sheriff's face. "What now?" Elias whispered. Hargrove looked back toward the cemetery, toward the shadows creeping between the stones. "Now," he said quietly, "we find out what climbed out of that tomb." He started the engine. "We find out if it's the only one." They drove off into the night, leaving behind the locked gate, the dead dog, the silent tomb, and the thing limping through the graves, heading somewhere only it knew. But before they were out of sight, a sound drifted through the trees. Not tapping. Not scraping. A voice. Weak. Broken. Human. It said one word. A name. Hargrove. The sheriff hit the brakes so hard Elias lurched forward. "Sheriff, did you hear?" But Hargrove didn't speak. Because he had heard it. He knew that voice. And it belonged to a man who had died 20 years ago. The drive back to Savannah was quiet, almost too quiet. Elias Turner sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands gripping the edges of the worn vinyl, replaying every second of the night. The streetlights passed like slow pulses of some distant heartbeat, illuminating his sweat-streaked face and the deep hollows under his eyes. Sheriff Hargrove didn't speak much either. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, jaw tight, eyes fixed ahead. But Elias could feel it, a storm of thought brewing behind those unyielding features. "Sheriff," Elias finally whispered, breaking the silence. "The tomb, that thing, it." Hargrove didn't answer. He kept his gaze on the road, as though speaking aloud might somehow make the horror real again. Elias tried to remember every detail of the figure, the gray, wrinkled skin, the hollow eyes that reflected the lantern light like twin black mirrors, the deep indentation of a coffin plate on its neck. It wasn't human in any ordinary sense, and yet, it had risen from the tomb as if breathing, thinking, moving with purpose. By the time they reached Hargrove's house on the outskirts of Savannah, the moon had drifted high, a pale eye staring down at the city. Hargrove parked the patrol car silently and gestured for Elias to follow him inside. Dr. Harlan Crow had agreed to meet them, reluctantly, after Hargrove had explained the situation over the radio. Crow was an old man now, shoulders bent, hair like thin silver threads, eyes sharp and calculating beneath heavy brows. He had been Savannah's coroner before a scandal, rumored, whispered, never proven, forced him into early retirement. Locals said he had seen too much, or perhaps things no one else could explain. "Sheriff Hargrove," Crow said when they entered, his voice brittle but firm. "You sound like a man who's seen death staring back." "I have," Hargrove replied, voice low, tight with tension. "And not the kind you expect." Crow motioned for them to sit at a small wooden table cluttered with stacks of old case files, yellowing newspapers, and jars of unidentified specimens preserved in formaldehyde. Elias shifted uncomfortably on the chair, glancing at the jars. Each contained small bones, teeth, and some strange items Crow wouldn't name. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and decay. "Explain," Crow said finally, cutting the tension like a scalpel. Elias swallowed hard and told the story again. From the tapping inside a tomb, the scraping, the cold gate locking on its own, to the figure that rose and then limped back toward the mausoleums. Hargrove added details only Crow would understand, subtle observations about the weight and movement of the tomb lid, the fresh soil at its base, and the animal prints that stopped without a trace. Crow leaned back, fingers steepled. "You realize you've awakened something very old," he murmured. "Something that should have stayed buried." Elias blinked. "Awakened? What do you mean?" "Like, a spirit?" Crow's eyes were cold, almost clinical. "No. Not a spirit. Something far older. Something human, and not." The watcher, the man buried there, was not an ordinary citizen of Savannah. That tomb was never meant for a resting soul. It was a prison. Hargrove frowned. "A prison?" "Yes. The stone slab, the tomb, the placement, all designed to contain him. The circle and split symbol on the lid isn't decoration, it's a binding sigil. Whoever carved it knew what they were dealing with. The watcher, or what he became, could not be trusted with freedom." Elias swallowed hard. "So, what came out of that tomb tonight? It's him." Crow leaned forward. "It is, but not completely. Whatever left that tomb, is only a fragment of what once was. Years in confinement, buried beneath centuries of earth, do things to a human body and mind. It changes them, reshapes them. And now, it's hungry. Hungry for the life it lost. Hungry for the light it never saw." The words sank into Elias like stones in his chest. He glanced at Hargrove, who simply nodded grimly, a silent acknowledgement that Crow's knowledge terrified them both. "Tonight," Crow continued, you saw the first stage. It rose, limped, retreated. That's the initial emergence. Soon, it will test its freedom. It will move further, observe more, interact, until it remembers everything, or enough to act. And when it does, it will not recognize any law, any boundary, any mortal fear. Elias felt his stomach twist. So, we can't stop it. Crow didn't flinch. You can delay it. You can contain it, temporarily. But you cannot kill it. Not with bullets, not with fire, not with anything known to the living. It will adapt. And the next time it comes for the living, it will not be satisfied with a dog or a lone gravekeeper. It will come for humans. And it will know exactly what to do. Hargrove slammed his fist against the table. So what the hell am I supposed to do with that? Call in the army? Wait for it to decide to play with us first. Crow's gaze didn't waver. Preparation. Observation. Documentation. Understand its patterns before it fully awakens. That is your only chance. Elias felt like the room had grown colder. Patterns? How do you study something like that? From the shadows it leaves, Crow replied. Every movement, every sound, every footprint, every disturbed stone. You document. You map. You learn. And most importantly, he leaned in close, voice dropping to a whisper. You survive long enough to tell the story. That is the key. The old coroner paused, allowing his words to sink in. Elias felt a cold sweat bead on his forehead. He glanced at Hargrove, who sat rigid, jaw set, staring at the floor. Neither man had spoken for a long moment. Finally, Crow said, You leave tonight unprepared at your own peril. And the city, Savannah, will not understand what is coming. They never do. They never listen until it is too late. The clock on Crow's wall ticked slowly, each second like the hammer of a distant bell. Elias couldn't look away from the jars on the shelves, from the specimens inside, some clearly decades old, some seemingly more recent. A sense of dread clawed at him. Tomorrow, Crow said, straightening, you return to Greywick. You set your watch. You note everything unusual. And you do not engage it alone. The sheriff will be your shield, and you will follow his lead. But tonight, he gestured at the darkening windows, the approaching moonlight spilling across the floor. Tonight, it is gathering strength. You rest. You prepare. And you pray you do not dream what I have seen. The two men left Crow's house in silence, the words echoing in their minds like whispers of a curse. Outside, the streets of Savannah were quiet. The air carried the faint tang of the river and the distant smell of magnolia flowers. But Elias knew better. He could feel the pulse of the cemetery, the heartbeat of something unnatural stirring beneath the ground. That night, as he tried to sleep, he found it impossible. Images of the figure, gray-skinned and limping, flashed behind his eyelids. He could still hear the tapping, the scraping, the low hiss of breath from beneath the tomb. And every so often, a whisper of a name. Not his own. Not anyone he knew. But a voice from beyond, stretching centuries, reaching for the present. Hours passed. Dawn crept across Savannah in pale streaks. Birds called. The city awoke. And yet, when Elias looked toward Greywick Cemetery from the window of his small apartment, it seemed different. Quieter. Waiting. Watching. Because it wasn't just a tomb anymore. It was a sentinel. A warning. And whatever had risen that night, would rise again. And when it did, the real horror of Greywick Cemetery would begin. Savannah's streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, filling every empty space with its weight. Elias Turner walked beside Sheriff Hargrove as they approached Greywick Cemetery once again. The morning sunlight was already fading, replaced by the creeping shadows of an early evening that seemed thicker than usual, almost tangible, like the air itself carried the memory of the night before. Elias carried a notebook and a flashlight, though the sun was still bright enough to make its beam unnecessary. Hargrove had his revolver holstered and a determined frown that suggested he had already decided he would not leave the cemetery tonight until he understood what they were dealing with. "You sure about this?" Elias asked, voice tight. "After last night, after what we saw, are we even ready?" Hargrove didn't answer immediately. He scanned the rows of headstones, the twisted oak trees, the moss swaying like quiet ghosts in the breeze. "Ready or not, Turner, it doesn't matter. That thing is awake now. We don't get to choose the night it comes for us." The cemetery was quieter than ever. Even the crickets and the wind seemed to have retreated, leaving only the occasional rustle of leaves. Elias felt it in his bones, something was watching, moving just out of sight, a presence older than the city itself. They approached the watcher's tomb, the stone slab still perfectly flush with the surrounding surface. Crow's words echoed in Elias's mind, this was a prison. And the prison had begun to fail. Hargrove crouched, examining the base of the tomb. "Fresh dirt," he muttered. "It's been dug at least a foot. Not by humans. Not recently. But it moved." Elias swallowed. "So it's coming back, soon?" Hargrove didn't answer. He stood, eyes narrowing toward the far edge of the cemetery. Then, faint at first, he noticed it, a figure moving silently between the graves, almost blending with the shadows. "There," Hargrove said, voice low. "Do you see it?" Elias followed his gaze. The watcher. Gray-skinned, gaunt, eyes hollow, moving with an unnatural limp. Its movements were deliberate now, cautious, as though it were testing the world it had forgotten existed above its tomb. "It's observing," Elias whispered. Hargrove nodded. "Yes. And judging. And waiting. That's what makes it dangerous." The watcher stopped at a cluster of graves near the center of the cemetery. It crouched, sniffing, brushing its long fingers over the tombstones. It seemed to pause, as if remembering, trying to reconstruct some fragment of life lost centuries ago. Elias felt his stomach tighten. Why is it, touching them? Recognition, Crow had said. Or curiosity. It remembers faces, places, but twisted through time and confinement. Anything familiar will draw it. A sudden breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves, carrying a faint metallic scent. Elias shivered. Something was near. Not the watcher, but another presence. Something smaller, moving fast. Hargrove's gun went up instantly. "Stay behind me." The rustling grew louder. A shadow darted past an old mausoleum. Hargrove fired once, a warning shot into the darkness. Silence returned, but heavier, charged with tension. Elias's notebook shook in his hands. "It's following us," he whispered. Hargrove's eyes darted to the watcher. It had noticed. Its head turned slowly, eyes locking onto theirs with a gaze that seemed to pierce the night, intelligent and calculating. Then it moved, swiftly, silently, a predator on instinct. The limping gait was gone, replaced with a creeping speed, each step precise, deliberate. Elias felt terror claw at him. "Sheriff, it's faster than before." Hargrove didn't hesitate. He fired twice, both shots hitting the watcher, but again, no blood, no slowing. The creature stopped for a heartbeat, head tilting, and then resumed, ignoring the bullets like they were whispers in the wind. "You said it adapts." Elias shouted, panic rising. "It's learning." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "Then we need to think faster than it does. Stay close." The watcher circled them now, moving among the graves, testing, probing, like a hunter savoring the silence before the strike. Its breathing was low, harsh, a rasping sound that made Elias's skin crawl. Suddenly, a shrill cry shattered the stillness. From the edge of the cemetery, a young boy ran toward them, tears streaming down his face, clothes torn, bare feet bleeding from the gravel. "Help me," he screamed. "It took my sister." Elias froze. "Who, what?" Hargrove grabbed the boy by the shoulders. "Calm down. Tell me everything." The boy gasped, pointing toward the northern end of the cemetery. She went near the big tomb, the one with the circle. Then it grabbed her. She screamed and I ran. Elias's blood ran cold. The Watcher, he whispered. Hargrove's grip on the revolver tightened. It's taking its prey, learning its limits, testing its control. They ran toward the northern tomb, the boy screaming directions. The Watcher was there, crouched over a figure lying on the ground, small, fragile, human. Its fingers brushed over her, almost gently, but the girl's cries were sharp, piercing. Elias's flashlight beam trembled as he focused on the scene. The Watcher's head turned, and in that moment, he saw something impossible. Underneath the rotting skin, the hollows, the twisted limbs, there was recognition. Its eyes, black and empty, flickered with memory. A fragment of humanity. The Watcher hissed, low and warning. Hargrove fired, and the sound echoed, ricocheting through the cemetery like a gunshot in a cave. The creature flinched, but did not retreat. Elias stepped forward, trembling. We can't kill it. Crow said that. The Watcher shifted, dragging itself backward toward its tomb. The girl scrambled to her feet, crying, terrified, yet unhurt. The Watcher stopped at the base of the tomb, crouched, and for a moment, Elias thought it would vanish entirely. Then it did something unexpected, it spoke. A voice, gravelly, broken, a whisper almost swallowed by the night. Marshall. Hargrove's eyes widened. His name. Spoken by something that should have been dead for decades. The Watcher raised its head, slowly, deliberately, and then, without another word, it disappeared into the shadows, blending with the darkness between the stones, vanishing from sight. Elias and Hargrove didn't move immediately. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with the knowledge that the Watcher had tested them, claimed a victim, not in death, but in terror, and now retreated to plan its next move. The girl ran into the sheriff's arms, crying, shaking, whispering, It's gone. Yes, Hargrove said, holding her close. Then he turned to Elias. We've seen what it can do. And now we know, tonight was just the beginning. Elias nodded slowly, understanding in a way he hadn't before. This wasn't about ghosts or superstition. This was about a creature, an intelligence, bound by a tomb, released into a world it had forgotten, and it was learning. As they led the girl back to her parents, Elias looked toward the northern tomb once more. The sun had set completely now, and the cemetery was bathed in silver moonlight. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the graves, twisting with a life of their own. Somewhere in that darkness, the Watcher waited. Observed. Remembered. And prepared for what would come next. Hargrove spoke softly, almost to himself. We survive tonight. Tomorrow, we study. We plan. And we hope it doesn't forget how to be human completely before it decides it doesn't need us anymore. Elias shivered. And if it does? Hargrove's jaw tightened. Then Savannah will learn the price of disturbing the dead. The wind shifted. Spanish moss swayed. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, or perhaps, a step. The Watcher was moving. Watching. Waiting. And as the men left Greywick Cemetery that night, Elias Turner understood one chilling truth: the gate would slam again. Not just to warn. Not just to trap. But to mark the beginning of a nightmare that had only just begun. The streets of Savannah were drenched in an uneasy silence that night, heavier than the humidity that clung to the air like a wet blanket. Even the river seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if warning the city of what was about to unfold. Elias Turner and Sheriff Marshall Hargrove approached Greywick Cemetery once again, hearts pounding, senses stretched to the limit. Tonight would not be a watchful observation. Tonight would not be survival by coincidence. Tonight, the Watcher would make its move, and they had to be ready. Elias carried the lantern and a new sense of dread. Each swing of the light revealed the familiar cracked stones, the twisted oaks, and the moss draped like silent sentinels. The wind whispered through the cemetery, carrying faint echoes of the past, voices, cries, whispers, and Elias felt as though the graves themselves were leaning forward, straining to witness what was about to happen. Hargrove moved beside him, revolver drawn, eyes scanning every shadow. "Keep close," he muttered. "Don't speak unless you have to." One wrong sound, his jaw tightened, voice trailing into a grim silence. The Watcher had disappeared last night, retreating into the shadows after taking its victim, the girl, and leaving terror in its wake. But Hargrove knew better. It had only withdrawn temporarily. The creature was patient. Calculating. Learning. And tonight, they would confront it at its own ground, the tomb it had once called prison. The northern tomb loomed ahead, blackened stone glinting faintly under the moon. Hargrove crouched beside it, inspecting the base. "Fresh dirt again," he said, voice low, almost reverent in fear. "It's digging. Or something's digging for it." Elias peered down at the disturbed earth. Loose soil spilled across the cracked stones, forming a small mound. "Do you think it's trying to get out, completely?" Hargrove shook his head. "Not out. Forward. It's moving among us. Testing boundaries. Tonight, we find out how far it's willing to go." They advanced carefully, the lantern illuminating the intricate wrought iron gate at the entrance. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the faintest metallic screech. Elias froze. "The gate." Hargrove didn't respond. He had already seen the subtle movement, the slight sway of the iron as if a hand brushed against it. Not fully open. Not fully shut. But alive. Breathing. Waiting. Then came the sound. Low at first. Almost imperceptible, a scratching, like nails across stone. It grew steadily, methodical, relentless. Elias felt his stomach knot. "It's coming," he whispered. From the shadows, a figure emerged. The Watcher. Pale, gaunt, eyes black hollows that seemed to see into their very souls. But tonight, it moved differently. No longer limping, no longer cautious. It glided with unnatural precision, each step silent, controlled. It stopped just beyond the tomb, head tilting, examining them, not with mindless hunger, but with cold intelligence. Elias raised the lantern, shaking violently. "Sheriff, it knows we're here." Hargrove nodded. "And it knows we're afraid." The Watcher stepped forward, dragging one skeletal hand along the top of a gravestone, brushing moss and lichen aside. A strange hiss escaped its throat, half whisper, half growl. Then it vanished briefly, slipping behind the tomb, only to reappear moments later, closer than before. Elias could feel the tension coil in the air, a physical thing pressing against his chest. "It's stalking," he breathed. "Yes," Hargrove muttered, voice tight. "And it's learning to manipulate fear. To control it. Watch the shadows, Turner. Don't let it slip into yours." Suddenly, the cemetery erupted into motion. A series of faint, urgent cries rose from the far side of the grounds. Lights flickered in nearby homes, and somewhere, a dog barked. The Watcher reacted instantly, spinning toward the sounds with uncanny speed. It wasn't attacking yet, it was observing. Calculating. Hargrove and Elias moved cautiously, following its gaze. Then, at the edge of the cemetery, they saw movement, figures rising from shallow graves. Not corpses in decay, but bodies animated, pale, stiff, eyes blank, crawling over the earth as if pulled by unseen strings. Elias staggered back. "Sheriff, no, there." "Yes," Hargrove whispered, voice a harsh rasp. "The unburied. It's calling them. Leading them. And we are next if we don't act." The Watcher's head tilted slightly, black eyes gleaming under the moonlight. It raised a hand, and the figures froze. Then, like an invisible conductor, it directed them to move, march, and surround Hargrove and Elias. Elias's heart raced. "We can't fight all of them." Hargrove aimed his revolver, shaking. "We won't. Not all. But we'll make them think twice." The first corpse-like figure approached. Its skin was tight, pale, its movements jerky but purposeful. Hargrove fired twice, hitting it in the chest. No blood. No reaction. It fell, but rose immediately, unfazed. Elias gulped. They don't die. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. They aren't alive. And they aren't dead. Something is controlling them. The Watcher. That thing, it's building an army. The Watcher stepped closer, hissing softly, the faintest sound like whispers in a long-forgotten language. Elias felt the cold creep into his bones, the oppressive weight of something ancient, beyond human comprehension. We need to get to the tomb. Hargrove said. It's the source. They ran, weaving between graves, the unburied figures closing in behind them. Each step brought a new horror, hands clawing, shadows stretching, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Elias could feel his mind fraying under the pressure. Every instinct screamed to flee. But the tomb awaited, and Hargrove was relentless. They reached the Watcher's tomb, panting, sweat streaming despite the cold night air. The Watcher hovered near the edge, watching, anticipating. Elias noticed something strange, the ground beneath the tomb lid had shifted again. A faint crack ran across its surface, almost imperceptible. Hargrove knelt. It's opening itself. Preparing something. Elias swallowed hard. It's going to rise fully. Hargrove's hand tightened on his revolver. And when it does, we either stop it here, or Savannah dies. The Watcher's figure shimmered slightly, almost like a distortion in the air. Its voice echoed faintly. Marshall. The name hit Hargrove like a physical blow. It was the same voice from before. The weight of recognition, of ancient grudges, pressed down on him. Then, the tomb lid split, cracking violently. Dust and earth erupted, choking the air. From within, a low, inhuman growl rolled across the cemetery. The Watcher stepped aside, and something massive began to emerge. A figure, taller, broader, more imposing than before, rising from its earthen prison, skeletal fingers digging into the moonlit ground. Elias could hardly breathe. Sheriff, it's enormous. Hargrove raised his gun. Aim for the head. That's all we get. But as they fired, bullets glanced harmlessly off its skin. The Watcher stepped forward, guiding the unburied into a semicircle around the tomb, cutting off any escape. Elias realized the truth, the Watcher wasn't just a single entity. It was a master, a puppeteer, and its army, animated, obedient, and relentless, would obey its commands without question. Hargrove's voice was calm but deadly serious. We can't fight them all. But we can make them hesitate. Distract. We need the tomb sealed. Now. Elias nodded, trembling. How? With fire, Hargrove said. Anything that scares them. Anything that forces them back. Then, we bury it, again. They grabbed torches from a nearby shed, igniting them carefully. Flames hissed as they touched the dry grass, smoke curling into the night. The unburied recoiled at the light, halting their advance. The Watcher hissed, frustrated, and for a moment, its eyes flickered with something almost human, annoyance, anger, perhaps recognition of fear. Elias and Hargrove advanced, driving the unburied back into their shallow graves. The Watcher tried to intervene, but the light forced it to retreat temporarily. They shoveled earth, sealing the tomb lid with every ounce of strength they had. Finally, with one last shove, the stone slab settled flush. Silence fell. The Watcher was gone. The unburied froze, then collapsed back into the soil, inert. Elias sank to his knees, exhausted, terrified, alive. Hargrove stood, revolver in hand, watching the tomb as if daring the Watcher to return. Tonight, we survived, Hargrove said. But it's only a matter of time before it learns, adapts, and comes back. And next time, it won't be just the dead it controls. It'll want more. It'll want us. Elias nodded, swallowing hard. So, what now? Hargrove looked toward the city, lights twinkling peacefully, ignorant of the horrors lurking just beyond their homes. We wait. We study. We prepare. Because Greywick Cemetery, and the Watcher, are not done with Savannah. Not by a long shot. The wind shifted again. Spanish moss swayed. Somewhere, faintly, a gate creaked, then slammed shut. And Elias Turner understood fully, with a dread that burned deep into his soul, that the night of the unburied was only the beginning. The nights in Savannah had grown restless, as if the city itself was holding its breath, bracing for an unseen storm. Ever since the confrontation at Greywick Cemetery, whispers traveled faster than the wind. Windows rattled without cause, stray cats screamed at nothing, and the river's gentle murmur had taken on a hollow, mournful tone. Elias Turner couldn't sleep, even in the relative safety of his small apartment near the historic district. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every creak of the floorboards became a whisper from the watcher, reminding him that nothing was truly safe. Sheriff Marshal Hargrove arrived at his home late that afternoon, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He carried no revolver today, only a small notebook filled with sketches and observations from Greywick. He slammed the door shut behind him. "Elias," he said, voice low but urgent, "we've underestimated it. We thought it would stay in the cemetery. That it was bound there. We were wrong." Elias looked up from the couch, his hands still shaking from the torchwork and the burial the night before. "It can't leave the cemetery. It's tied to the tomb, isn't it?" Hargrove shook his head slowly. "That's what I thought. But tonight," he paused, grimacing. "Tonight, I got a call. A farmer, out near the outskirts, swears something pale, human-shaped, tried to drag his son into the woods. He says it vanished when he shone a lantern at it. And the boy's terrified, trembling, saying the figure spoke his name." Elias's stomach churned. It's spreading. Growing bolder." "Yes," Hargrove said, leaning against the wall. "And it's learning. Last night, the watcher controlled the unburied in the cemetery. Tonight, it's testing us outside. Walking among us. Picking targets." The city, still unaware, went about its evening routines. Lights flickered, shadows moved oddly in narrow alleys, and people whispered of strange occurrences, but no one could imagine the reality. Not yet. Elias and Hargrove prepared themselves as night fell. Torches, chains, and weapons lined the back of Hargrove's car, alongside shovels and stakes. Not to fight, not to kill, but to survive long enough to learn the Watcher's plan. By 11 p.m., the city was quiet. Too quiet. And then the first incident happened, a scream, distant but unmistakable, tearing through the streets like a blade. They raced toward it, hearts hammering. On a narrow cobblestone alley, they found a man pinned against a wall, pale hands wrapped around his chest as if invisible fingers were dragging him upward. His eyes were wide, mouth open in silent terror. Elias grabbed his lantern. The light revealed the culprit, not fully solid, a distorted human figure, gray as ash, eyes glowing faintly red. The Watcher had sent an emissary, one of its unburied, now roaming freely, no longer confined to Greywick Cemetery. Hargrove shouted. "Let him go." The figure twisted unnaturally, releasing the man with a hiss that sounded like cracked iron. It stepped back into the shadows, then vanished. Elias turned to the man. "Are you okay?" The man nodded shakily, unable to speak. His eyes darted to every shadow, every corner. Hargrove clenched his fists. "This is worse than I imagined. It's not just the cemetery anymore. The Watcher is moving among us." The two men returned to Greywick Cemetery to regroup. The tomb, sealed tightly, stood like a dark sentinel in the moonlight. The air around it seemed heavier tonight, thicker, almost breathing. Hargrove knelt beside the stone slab. "It's like it's drawing strength from the city now. From fear. From life. Every panic, every scream, it grows stronger. And I fear, Elias, tonight, it will test us directly." At precisely midnight, the gate began to move. Not a slam this time, but a slow, deliberate creak. The iron twisted under some invisible force. Hargrove and Elias approached cautiously. Shadows coalesced, forming figures, dozens of them, crawling from shallow graves surrounding the cemetery. Each figure mirrored the Watcher's pale, gaunt form, yet smaller, weaker, but numerous. Elias whispered, "It's leading them, drawing them toward the city." "Yes," Hargrove said. "And we have to stop it here. Or Savannah loses everything." The Watcher appeared at the center of the cemetery, pale face glowing faintly under the moonlight, eyes fixed on them. It moved with deliberate grace, as if orchestrating the attack. Its hand raised, and the unburied responded instantly, moving in unison, their jerky motions masking a terrifying coordination. Hargrove took a deep breath. "We can't fight them head-on. We need to divide them, separate them, and then, the tomb." Elias nodded. "Distraction, fire, anything to make them retreat." They set torches along a path leading away from the tomb, luring the unburied toward the flames. Hargrove fired warning shots, guiding them. Some fell back, hesitant in the face of light. The Watcher hissed in frustration. It stepped closer, the air around it vibrating with cold menace. Then it spoke, low and guttural, "Marshal, you cannot stop what has risen." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Watch me." With a signal, Elias kicked the first torch into the circle of unburied. Fire roared, shadows twisted, and some figures stumbled backward. The Watcher screeched, a sound that pierced the night and rattled the very stones. Elias and Hargrove advanced, shovels in hand, ready to reinforce the tomb. But as they reached it, a new horror emerged. The Watcher, now fully solid, stood in front of the lid. Its eyes burned like coals, its body tense, every muscle ready to resist. Hargrove swung a shovel. "Get out of the way." The Watcher hissed and leapt backward, landing silently among the unburied, signaling them to regroup. They surged forward again, closing the circle. Elias slammed the tomb lid with all his strength. Dust and soil flew. The Watcher shrieked, a sound of rage and frustration, yet it could not lift the lid entirely. Hargrove and Elias reinforced the slab with rocks and chains, sweat pouring from their faces, hearts hammering. Finally, with a last shove, the tomb sealed. Silence fell. The unburied collapsed back into the graves, inert once more. Elias collapsed beside the tomb, gasping. We did it. For now." Hargrove leaned against the stone, revolver still drawn. "For now," he echoed. "But this is only a pause. A temporary retreat. The Watcher has tasted the city's fear. It has learned. And soon, it will rise again." As the first pale light of dawn crept across Savannah, the city seemed peaceful. Children laughed, merchants shouted, and the river flowed gently, unaware of the horrors that had stalked it hours before. But in the shadows, behind closed doors and in silent alleyways, the Watcher waited. Patient. Intelligent. Hungry. And Elias Turner knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the night of the unburied was only the beginning. Savannah never slept the same after the events at Graywick Cemetery. Even in the brightest hours of day, shadows seemed to linger longer, twisting unnaturally across the brick streets. The Watcher's presence had seeped beyond the gates, beyond the ancient tombs, and into the very air of the city. People whispered of glimpses in alleyways, of figures standing silently in empty streets, of cold breaths against the nape of the neck when no one was behind them. Elias Turner and Sheriff Marshal Hargrove had spent the past week preparing, gathering chains, iron spikes, lanterns, and holy water, anything they thought could stop the Watcher. But every night, it seemed, the creature and its unburied grew bolder, smarter. It was no longer just haunting, it was strategizing. The final night began with a heavy fog rolling in from the river, swallowing the streets in a gray shroud. Hargrove and Elias made their way to Graywick Cemetery once more, moving silently through the mist, their lanterns cutting through only the nearest shadows. The tomb sat at the center, deceptively still. "Tonight," Hargrove whispered, "we end this. Or it ends Savannah." Elias nodded, gripping the chains they had brought. "No mistakes tonight. We lock it in, once and for all." The air grew colder as midnight approached. The fog thickened, carrying faint whispers that seemed to come from the very ground. Elias shivered. "It's waiting." At 12:03 a.m., the moment that had haunted the city for weeks arrived. The cemetery gate slammed open, not shut this time, but with a force that knocked the lanterns from Elias' hands. Shadows poured from the surrounding graves like a river of darkness, the unburied rising in perfect unison. The Watcher emerged last, taller than ever, eyes glowing faint red, teeth bared in a snarl that seemed to split the night. Its presence radiated cold, unnatural, and suffocating. Hargrove shouted, "Positions! Now!" They ran toward the tomb, swinging chains and shovels, luring the unburied into traps they had set. Lanterns spilled oil over the gravel, creating walls of fire that caused several of the creatures to hesitate, smoke curling around their ashen bodies. The Watcher screamed, a sound that made the very ground tremble. Elias reached the tomb. "Sheriff! Help me with the chains." Together, they wrapped thick iron chains around the stone lid, hammering the spikes into the earth to anchor it. The Watcher lunged, hands clawing at the chains, shrieking in fury, but the metal held. Its unburied followers paused, hissing and writhing, unable to step beyond the barrier of fire and iron. The air was thick with smoke, fog, and the scent of damp earth. Elias could feel his heart hammering in his chest, each beat counting down the moments until the Watcher might break free. Finally, with one last heave, they secured the chains. The tomb lid rattled violently but did not budge. The Watcher screamed, a long, keening wail that echoed through Savannah's streets, shaking windows and rattling doors, but slowly, its voice faded. The fog lifted, revealing the calm dawn of a city spared, for now. The unburied collapsed into the graves, still as stone once more. Elias and Hargrove stood, panting, sweat and ash coating their faces, knowing the fight had been won, at least temporarily. "Is it over?" Elias asked, voice barely a whisper. Hargrove shook his head slowly. "For now. But it's patient. It's learning. One day, it will rise again. And when it does, we won't be ready unless Savannah remembers." The two men left Greywick Cemetery, locking the gate with multiple iron locks and chains. Behind them, the tomb stood silent, a grim monument to a terror that refused to die. And so ends the tale of the cemetery gate that slammed itself every night, a story that began in whispers and ended in screams, leaving only questions for those who dare to wonder what waits in the shadows when no one is looking. But before you go, I want to know, if you were in Elias or Hargrove's shoes, would you stay to face the Watcher, or run for your life? Comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunted Graves After Dark for more stories that will keep you up at night. Remember, the shadows are always closer than you think.